For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shona Mortia and I direct the Centre for Civil Society at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. And this is the second of our seminars where we are having discussions about civil society, and we're doing this in collaboration with CIVICUS. And today we're very, very excited to have Andrew Firmin speaking. Andrew is Editor-in-Chief at CIVICUS, the Global Civil Society Alliance, and his main role is to research the CIVICUS State of Civil Society report, and he also is involved in writing it. And this report is a regular and systematic analysis of civil society trends, challenges, and responses. And the topic of Andrew's seminar today is solidarity in the time of COVID, civil society responses to the pandemic. So the focus is some of the key civil society responses to the COVID-19 pandemic that unfolded during 2020. It sets out how civil society organizations provided help, how they defended rights, and how civic action was sustained through new and alternate means and tactics. So I'm going to now hand over to Danford, who is facilitating the webinar. Andrew, just making sure that you are comfortable with us recording, because what we do with these webinars is we upload them to the CCS YouTube channel for people who couldn't make it this time so that they can watch it later. So we just want to be sure that you are comfortable with this. And I'm going to hand over now to Danford. Thank you, Andrew. A very warm welcome and thank you for joining us. And we hope to be able to connect much more closely in the future as well. And welcome, David, again. You're going to be co-presenting. Thanks. Danford, over to you.
Thank you, Shona. Welcome, Andrew, to the Center for Civil Society. I'll be facilitating this session. I'll give you 30 minutes to share your work, to share your report with us. And then we'll take questions from the audience. The audience, you can put your questions in the chat box, and then we have a Q&A session at the end of his presentation. Over to you, Andrew. Thank you so much for making time to come and present your work here at the Center for Civil Society.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, colleagues at the Centre for inviting Civicus into this. Just checking in, David, did you want to say anything before I start on this?
No, Andrew, maybe just to reiterate our thanks at Civicus to you for taking time to present the findings of the report. Like Shauna said, this is the second presentation and collaboration between Civicus and the Center, and we look forward to not just the presentation, but also ongoing collaboration as the need arises in the future. And just to say, unlike last week, Andrew will be the sole presenter for this afternoon, and I'm happy to listen in and make contributions also as a participant at the end of the presentation. So thanks again to Shauna and colleagues, and to you, Andrew. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the content of the presentations as well.
All right, cheers, David. Thanks for that. And there's a PowerPoint, right, which I understand is going to be shared, so I hope people will be able to see that.
Yes, Mel, if you can share the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Okay, so can people see that? I can't.
No, we're not seeing.
Hi, Andrew.
Okay.
I'm using my phone, so I'm trying to get it on. I'll try and get it on now on the screen.
Okay, thanks, Melanie.
Thanks.
I know it's not easy if you're using phones in particular.
Yeah.
Melanie, could you just not enable the share and allow Andrew to share it?
Yeah,
I did that. Yeah, Andrew, I did enable it. Can you try and do it from your
Okay,
side?
let me get it up on my screen.
Thank you.
And then
Andrew.
see if I can share my screen. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, everyone. Please just bear with us. We'll get it up.
Okay. Right. Can people see that? Just somebody shout if you can.
Yes, we can
Yes,
see
we
it,
can.
Andrew.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to talk briefly about work we've been doing at Civicus during the pandemic. Obviously, you know, the pandemic represented this generational test for our societies and our institutions, and for civil society, for civil society organizations and civil society ways of working. This was really a test that for many, in many societies, was unprecedented, and even in societies that have experienced a level of disruption and humanitarian emergency and conflict in recent decades, and other pandemics like Ebola, there was still a sense that you know, COVID represented a test of the resilience of civil society, and offered a sort of test case for how civil society is perceived by the authorities and by publics. So I'm going to try and go to the next slide. So, you know, first let's talk about, you know, a particular preoccupation of Civicus is civic space. And I'm sure you heard about this in the last presentation by David and Ines. You know, the civic space, essentially the ability of people to enjoy the key civic freedoms of association, peaceful assembly and expression, and the extent to which human rights defenders are able to act in safety, the extent to which civil society is enabled. We already lived in very contested and difficult times for civic space before the pandemic started. You know, it's something like 3% of the world's population live in conditions of open civic space. Everyone else lives in conditions where these key civic freedoms are contested, and the contestation of civic space and civic freedoms has intensified in recent years in every continent, and in the global north and global south, and in the west and in the east. There's intensified attacks on civic space from state authorities, and also a growing trend of attacks on civic space from non-state forces that may be aligned to ruling interest. So we went into the pandemic with all those challenges already, and it's not a surprise that during these times of emergency, the civic space conditions have generally got appreciably worse in most contexts. Particularly the highest number of attacks on civic space we've recorded on Civics Monitor, which is our online platform that tracks civic space in every country. The highest levels of attacks are around media and information. So the biggest number of attacks under the pandemic are to do with censorship, or to do with attacks on journalists and media workers, both violent attacks and smears, and online attacks, and around censorship. So there's a kind of information war going on during the pandemic. You know, and obviously we live at a time where disinformation is its own epidemic, and we all daily deal with the challenges caused by disinformation. Disinformation is often leveled by against civil society by those who wish to attack us, but you've seen this kind of intensifying contestation around who gets to determine what is legitimate information, and a lot of states have tried to monopolize the flow of information, right? And that has included trying to restrict the media and trying to restrict civil society from legitimate inquiry, right? Including legitimate inquiry over the decisions governments have taken in response to the pandemics, which haven't always been the best decisions, including over the use of resources, including over corruption that has been seen in many contexts, in the distribution of supplies, in the distribution of contracts to address the pandemic. So yeah, this has been one of the real problems of civil society under the pandemic: increasing censorship, increasing restriction, increasing attacks for just legitimate inquiry, the targeting of activists and journalists, and the other side of that has been obviously increased surveillance, and then there's been challenges around how restrictions are enforced and policed. What lockdowns or other forms of restriction are often, in many contexts, have been brutally policed. They've been policed with excessive force. Particularly excluded groups have been on the blunt end of police violence. The groups that have the least power have been attacked most for alleged breaches of emergency restrictions, such as lockdowns and other restrictions. And you've seen a lot of new laws passed really quickly. I think at least 37 countries have passed new laws on information and disinformation. So what we've got during this time of emergency is a lot of fast and bad lawmaking. A lot of laws have been passed really quickly that haven't been properly considered. What's one of the fears about this for civil society? Emergency powers tend to be sticky, right? They tend to stick. We know this from in the context of the 9/11 attacks a decade or so ago, and the terrorism laws that were passed, particularly in many global North societies, but then were copied in many global South societies. Those laws, often you have powers which are supposed to be emergency powers, and then they've stuck and they've lasted and persisted. France is an example of a country that's been under emergency powers that have become permanent, right, in response to terrorism. And so the fear is that we've had bad laws and emergency powers, and they're going to last even when this pandemic's over. The suspicion, of course, is that some states have used the pandemic as a pretext to centralize and monopolize power in a way that they couldn't get away with in non-pandemic conditions. And they've taken the opportunity to settle some scores with those who ask questions of power, including civil society. So, there has to be quite a lot of concern about the space for civil society under the pandemic. But it's important to say there's more than one story about this pandemic, right? And this restriction of civil society, it's not been the only story. What we also need to talk about are the ways in which civil society was able to respond to the pandemic. So, which is particularly what we focused on in our research that we published last November, but that is still ongoing, and we're still looking for examples. We really wanted to understand last year how civil society was making a difference in responding to the pandemic. Because we thought that was a story that wasn't being told enough. A lot of the story that was being told about the pandemic was about government responses and about the responses of international organizations, and the challenges and deficiencies around those responses. And while while all that was important, while states had a duty to protect citizens and to protect livelihoods, there was also a need for civil society to act, and civil society was acting all over the place to respond to the pandemic, and that wasn't a story that was always being told. So at Civicus, we wanted to document examples of civil society response and understand what this told us about the changing nature of civil society, what this told us, what civil society story this could tell us, what it might tell us about the value and contribution of civil society. And what we saw, is in country after country, civil society, the first thing civil society did was to reorient to meet basic and essential needs. So civil society quickly became, for communities, a key provider of food, of medicines, of protective equipment, sanitation, and in some cases cash. We know that one of the particular impacts of the pandemic, in every country, but obviously particularly marked in many countries of the global south, was the halting of people's ability to access livelihoods. People left without the essentials, particularly people who rely on daily paid work and non-formal work, and migrant workers who are often undocumented or out with the law. So civil society scrambled to meet those needs. And we saw a lot of existing organizations essentially completely reorient to doing new things, things they hadn't done before, like rights. But organizations that normally advocate for rights, deciding that suddenly they needed to provide medicines and provide food. And we saw a lot of new, at the same time as existing organizations reoriented, we saw a lot of new informal community initiatives spring up. Again, often just to feed people and to provide information. There was a lot of focus on trying to take official information from the World Health Organization and governments and to repackage it in ways that communities could understand. Often governments weren't doing this. They weren't providing information about how to protect yourself in languages that people used. And often new initiatives sprung up to do that. There's one example in Australia. There was in a tower block where many migrant communities lived, and the government was only providing information in English, and people self-organized in that tower block to translate protection information into all the languages of people who lived in there. And this was important because people were being held in that tower block by the police because it was a zone of infection, and the people didn't understand the situation. It hadn't been explained by the government. So a neighborhood initiative sprung up to do that. And we saw a lot of these very nimble new civil society forms spring up. And then we saw another interesting thing was initiatives didn't just focus on providing essential services. They also instinctively connected to advocacy for rights. So it wasn't really a hard and fast division. A lot of organizations did all of these things at the same time. You know, they provided essential services. They undertook advocacy. They tried to speak to government to maintain rights. They campaigned publicly to defend rights. So you know, there's often a kind of false dichotomy put on civil society as being, you know, on the one hand, there's service organizations, on the other hand, there's rights organizations. And actually, so we saw those divisions being erased in the response to the pandemic, calling into question how real those divisions are in reality. And we saw a lot of success come from advocacy. You know, in Brazil for a time, I think unfortunately sent, and now there was an emergency basic income provided during one of the waves of the pandemic, which came directly from a very fast civil society campaign that mobilized almost overnight, involved, you know, connected to celebrities and social media influencers. And, you know, this far right government in Brazil, the last thing you might have expected them to do was provide an emergency basic income, but they caved in to the demand. Such was the campaign that was mobilized in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. Civil society took the city council to court and won the right that the city council had to provide children with laptops and internet access to continue education during a lockdown. This was important because obviously Argentina is, like many countries, a country characterized by vast economic inequality, and children were expected to continue education remotely under lockdown. But obviously that patterned onto existing inequalities. Poor children and children in informal settlements and favelas, they couldn't get access to the equipment they need, and civil society was crucial in winning that. And we've even seen protest movements reorient and be part of the solution to helping communities. You know, the pandemic was a time when governments really tried to clamp down on the right to protest. And lots of protest movements tried to protest responsibly. They tried to distance, they tried to use masks. But protest movements, even while they were being attacked by the government, were also trying to provide services. The huge farmers protest movement in India was very prominent at the start of the year and settled into camps around Delhi. When India went into its third wave and had another shutdown, lots of migrant workers from elsewhere in India needed to head home from Delhi, and the farmers movement camped on the outskirts of Delhi helped organize food for the migrant workers who otherwise were traveling home without any food. The farmers reoriented to provide that. In Algeria, the Hirak protest movement, which has been calling for substantial political reform, organized itself to provide PPE to hospitals because the government was failing to do this. So their critique of their government's inadequacy and inefficiency dovetailed with this practical initiative to fill the gaps that had been left by government. And we saw lots of examples of this. And also an embrace of new online activity where possible. So a lot of civil society organizations really embraced online technology during this time as a continuation of services. We saw, one example of this was in Lebanon. Obviously, one of the big challenges of the pandemic was that I think in every country, I don't think there's any country where this didn't happen, gender-based violence increased and violence against women in the home increased as people were locked down in homes, and it became harder for women to escape violence in the home because a lot of the centers were shut down on the lockdowns. So Lebanon civil society produced camouflage videos where they communicated vital information, sort of tucked in social media videos so that women might be able to see these safely and call a helpline. A lot of organizations set up helplines as an alternative to physical outreach. We also saw a lot of protest move into the online space. One of the huge protest movements before the pandemic was obviously the global protest movement for climate action and climate justice, including for the school strike movement and Extinction Rebellion movement. A lot of that energy went online, and there was an embrace of online protests, particularly in Germany was one example where there was a lot of online protests because the environment movement there is particularly strong. Italy's movement against the far right took to, again, online protests. And so, we saw actually this division between online and offline kind of collapse for a lot of civil society groups. And a lot of dovetailing between online and offline action in a way that we haven't seen before. So again, it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out even following the pandemic, when this is finally in the rearview mirror. And we saw a lot of young people's movements as well, providing services. That was a really important initiative in a lot of places. So what are the lessons from this? Well, one of the lessons is that the existing civil society organizations were a really important part of the response. So there's a kind of, there was an existing civic capacity embodied in existing civil society organizations. And it was really important that that existed and it was available and could be reoriented to meeting this emergency. And so what does that tell us about the resourcing of civil society, right? It tells us that civil society organizations work best during this emergency when they could be flexible, where they could redeploy staff and financial resources really quickly. The challenge is that for many donors for civil society, they're moving away from more flexible funding and in recent years have more embraced very tightly defined project funding where it's very hard to vary. flexibility from civil society's donors was really important at this time as well, to allow that kind of flexibility around resources. It shows how insidious civic space crackdowns can be, right? At this time when civil society was really needed, it showed how important and open and enabled civic space is, right? Some of the countries that had the best response to the pandemic, and where civil society was able to play a really important part alongside a state response, had the lowest number of cases and the lowest fatality rate. We could see that there was an ideal model of response to this pandemic in which there was strong state action, but strong accountability over that action, and a strong role for civil society, both in providing services and holding the state to account. And that was the best model for handling this pandemic. And, you know, there are countries, South Korea and New Zealand and Taiwan, are all examples of countries where that have relatively open civic space, where civil society wasn't attacked, and that had did appreciably better in terms of case numbers and fatalities than similar countries, right? So I think there's a really important lesson here about the value of civil society and the case we can make for civil society. This makes it even more insidious that many states chose the pandemic as a pretext to further crack down on civil society. There was no need for this. It was the worst thing to do at the worst time. So you know, my conclusion of this is that civil society appreciably made a difference in responding to the pandemic. There were groups of people whose experience would have been far worse were it not for the actions of civil society. And those are particularly people from excluded groups who already going into the pandemic have the least power and the least voice. Women, young people, LGBTQI plus people, migrants and refugees. These are the groups that have the least power and where civil society appreciably made a difference. Now, of course, the pandemic was an overwhelming test. Civil society's capacity wasn't up to the task, and states needed to play a part. And but civil society was an essential part of the response blend in places where that really worked. And so there's a need to enable and support civil society, enable civic space rather than close civic space, and to enable the more flexible resourcing of civil society. Now, I just want to look forward to, if I can, to a time when this is all over and civil society. I just want to give a couple of examples here of the kind of community action. So there is an example there in India of a grassroots organization that worked with the people with the least economic power to provide food and masks, and reached about 30,000 people by doing so. So that's an example of a very sort of important grassroots community response. And then there's an example of an innovation that went online in the Philippines with an initiative that worked to promote children's involvement in the environment and in food production, children and young people, and how they moved a lot online and collaborated with people they could find in the private sector to help keep training young people during the time who otherwise might have been locked out of learning or would have experienced deepening exclusion from not being able to take part in physical learning activities during the pandemic. But anyway, yeah, just looking forward. This is really important time, I think, to dwell on the ideas civil society has developed and articulated for what we must learn from the pandemic and what we must do differently after the pandemic. And the first thing to say is that, because civil society was needed more than ever, because the importance of civil society is proven, we have to start reversing the rollback of civic space, and we have to enable civil society, and we have to enable civil society in all its varieties. formal organizations, informal groups, organizations that may have a service perspective, organizations that campaign and demand rights, because we needed all of them during this pandemic, and we needed all of them working together and each playing their part. We need really to focus on the redistribution of power to the most excluded groups, because the most excluded groups are the ones that suffered the most during the pandemic. So as society seek to rebuild the pandemic, we should be arguing for a radical redistribution of power rather than a return to the status quo. And that includes a serious conversation about economic and climate justice. Particularly our economic systems weren't found to be particularly resilient during this pandemic. The fear is that states will prioritize an economic recovery to the pandemic that doesn't do anything to help the most economically disadvantaged people, that actually increases economic inequality and that further depletes our planetary resources. You know, many states, we're seeing this kind of carbon-fueled dash for growth as the idea of the recovery that they need to do to the pandemic. Civil society's ideas here need to be listened to. And then finally, organizations like CIVICUS have been arguing for years that the international system is profoundly dysfunctional and not up to task, that it can't handle and alleviate the major problems of our day. And, you know, if anything, the pandemic shows we may have underestimated the scale of that problem. From the dysfunction of the World Health Organization to the utter inability of the UN Security Council to do anything about anything, to the dismal practice of vaccine nationalism and vaccine diplomacy, neither of which have anything to do with the humanitarian and universalist principles that motivate civil society. It means that conversations about global governance and how it can be reformed on some technical matter, they're urgently needed. You know, we know this isn't the last pandemic. We know this one isn't over yet. We know there are more waves to come. There are more variants to come. And even when this one is over, there's likely another pandemic down the road. And civil society's ideas about the reform of global governance, about how that can be made more democratic, about how power can be distributed globally between global North and global South states, about how democratic citizens' voices can be heard in global governance processes, about how civil society can play a greater role in holding international decision-making bodies to account. It's time for a serious conversation about all of those things. These are the key lessons that we need to learn from the pandemic. Now, I suspect I've spoken quite long enough, and that I hope there's time now for some discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. If the audience, if you've got, if you want to engage with Andrew, you can show by the ways of your virtual hand, then I will attend to you. But let me just start with the question that is posed here by Linda Mafu. What are the lessons learned in pandemic preparedness and response for civil society, as this will not be the last pandemic? What kind of resource is needed for civil society to sustain the advocacy ecosystem? This is the question that I have at the moment. I'll read the comments later. If Andrew, if you can answer that question, and if any one of you wants to engage Andrew, please show by raising your hand. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, look, clearly the lesson is nobody was prepared enough, right? Governments weren't prepared enough. International institutions weren't prepared enough, and civil society wasn't prepared enough. You know, I'm sure if we can think about our own practice, I'd say this even at CIVICUS. You know, we have the usual things that organisations have, like risk registers and attempts to predict potential problems. I don't think this was something that the potential of a pandemic to completely change the way we work was something that was discussed, right? What I would say is civil society has been the place where there's been maximum flexibility and rapidity of response. And that's been one of our great assets as civil society. It always has been. And for me, it's a reminder that those are the assets of civil society, that we should remain flexible and imaginative and creative and open to new ideas. We should very quickly be able to embrace new ways of working, as we've done. And the warning to civil society organizations from this is not to get too hidebound, not to get too staid or predictable, but to remain open to flexibility. The reality is that there are many civil society organizations that depend on donor funding, and the challenge to donors is to enable us to be more flexible and to enable us to develop the kind of capacities that were put to the test during this pandemic. And that's not the practice of most donors, and that's not the trend in donor practice right now, as I mentioned. Over the years, there's been an increasing projectization of donor funding to civil society. There's really still realistically hardly any ODA going directly to civil society organizations in the global south. So this needs to change. More donor funding needs to enable flexibility. That means more core funding. Often it seems a dirty word amongst donors, but there's no substitution for it. It means core funding, so civil society has capacities and resilience, and it means more core funding going to civil society in the global south, where in the main official capacities from state institutions for this kind of crisis are weaker. And as we've seen during the pandemic, no country was well prepared for this, but global north countries with particularly deep pockets were able to grab PPE and able to grab vaccines in a way that global south countries weren't. So yeah, that's it. More core funding, more funding to the global south from donors. But as I say, for civil society, it's about remaining flexible and nimble and open to ways of working. And, taking lessons from this pandemic about how we work and how we do things in future, learning that actually we don't need big offices. We don't need to do a lot of the travel that perhaps we were doing before this. There are some things we can do less of. And, if we're not spending money on travel, what can we spend on instead? And those kind of questions. So, yeah, I think there are some good things about how our practice has changed, and I wouldn't want civil society to lose once this pandemic is finally over. Anyway, sorry, I see there's another hand up.
Is there a hand up? I don't see any hand here. Let me see. No.
Oh, it's a hand up from Shona.
Oh, from Shona.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just read this comment from Nora, and then I'll get to you, Shona. Sure. Nora gives a comment here. We have also to consider conspiracy theory actively propagated by those who are anti-science and who undermine authoritative sources of information. There is increased support by anti-vaccine activists, anti-lockdown campaigners, anti-5G masks, and an increase in neo-fascism, including right-wing fascism. There is also distrust of governments, yet government action is needed in a pandemic. But whether the government has the people's interests at heart or big industry at heart is another issue. Shona, you can make a contribution now. Thank you, Nora, for this contribution.
Thanks so much, Dan. Andrew, my question was about donor support for civil society, but I think that I'm not really asking a question. I would like to engage on the issue, but perhaps it's more of a comment. So I had a conversation with a number of activists that work on social justice campaigns. And one of the things that they noted was that during the COVID-19 pandemic, they had to make the decision to cut back on programmatic activities and facilitate a more humanitarian response. And this was really because their lived realities are one of them said to me, our comrades had no food. And by and I'm quoting her directly, and by her comrades, she meant her fellow activists in the campaign. And there was a sense that donors needed to understand this. As another activist put it, it was our moral obligation to engage with donors on this issue. But they also activists also pointed out that they face crisis every day in their core work. So if you are working in the informal settlements, you are basically focused on socioeconomic rights in those informal settlements. The city comes in, starts shooting and evicting people, that's a crisis. So the point they were making is that donors need to understand, I suppose we can call it flexibility, donors need to be more flexible, but I don't know if maybe we should call it something else that is nearer to donors understanding that civil society campaigns and activists need to decide what the crisis is and how to respond. So many of them were able to repurpose some of their general funding budgets, as you said, but not so much their programmatic budgets. And I just wondered if in your research you came across any donors that behaved in a progressive way that could, that we could point to even beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. So in a way that allows activists and civil society campaigns, and these, the people I engaged with are people directly in touch with their grassroots base. So they are less these formalized NGOs, and, even though they may be registered as NGOs, not that I'm trying to set up a, dichotomy between an NGO and a social movement, but the point I'm making is that they are in close contact with the grassroots movement. And so for that voice to be clearer and for that voice to be able to use the funding, I'm not being very, very coherent, but I'm just wanting to know if you came across any donors that you thought behaved particularly well. Let me put it that way. Sorry for the long question. I have lots of questions, but I'm not going to abuse my time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the heart of it. It's about core funding. It's about flexible funding, and it's about where the decisions on funding are taken. And the challenge is, is the remoteness of donors from communities, right? And you had donors of ODA largely based in the capitals of global north countries, are so far removed from the communities that actually did effort that, of course, they work through NGOs as intermediaries, and then NGOs become essentially contractees of donors, carrying out donor instructions. This is not a model of development that works. That's the only problem with it. It works for the donors, right? Because they have confidence about how their money's been spent. They feel they can do due diligence. It doesn't really work for the NGO because, the NGO is contracted. It can't really do what it wants to do. It doesn't really work for the communities, especially during times of pandemic. So, it's like a profoundly dysfunctional approach to development. Why is it the case? Because, development is politically unpopular in the global north. Development funding is really unpopular. We saw that in the UK yesterday, where the cut of ODA was, voted through, over the last few years now. So there's a real problem there with how we do development practice. Some of the, and particularly from state-driven ODA, and this time it needs a fundamental shake-up. It needs the devolution of money nearer the place where the money is spent and decisions made by people closer to the communities where that money is going. So, the principle of subsidiarity needs to come into play here, where, decisions are taken at the lowest possible level and money is devolved to the lowest possible level. But, you can't do that until you change the way you understand risk about resources, and you can't do that until you reframe the way aid is understood by global north publics. So there's a long way to go on here. I mean, there are so I think there were some donors who are better than others. I don't have the facts at my fingertips here, and then I need to talk to my colleague Clara, who leads on our research on resourcing. But I know from our experience, perhaps some of the private philanthropic funders, the private foundations, were a bit more nimble than some of the government agencies. So there's probably more work to be done in researching the difference between the practice of, say, private foundations and the practice of state agencies in response to the pandemic, and that could be a fruitful area for further research. But I mean, that's the bottom line, is to win an argument for money and decision making being made in the global south at the level close as possible to the communities, and with as few intermediaries as possible. As I say, I think there's a long way to go on that. But if this time of emergency isn't a good time to have a debate about these fundamentals, then I don't think there'll ever be a good time.
Thank you, Andrew, for that response. I've also got some contributions here from Linda Mafu. Civil society also took the WHO information pack and made it accessible and consumable to communities, removing that academic jargon. Thank you for this contribution, Linda. Then Erwin is a follow-up contribution. He adds on top of Linda's contribution. Building further on what Linda states here, when I look at the news today here in Durban, in South Africa, there are a lot of people who very bravely and very actively take a stand because we are in an emergency and there are direct needs. But somehow also the problems that South Africa faces today could have been foreseen. Same with the pandemic. It seems very difficult to mentally prepare society for some hypothetical problem that lingers and may erupt sometime in the future. I think they're also adding on your point, Andrew, that we were not fully prepared for this pandemic, and that it seems as if in response, it sort of followed, the global politics of, the global north grabbing everything, and is the global south, we are left with nothing, even if we have the money to buy. Because I was following one of the African businessmen from my country, Strive Masiwa. He said that they actually approached the global community with money, but they were told that the vaccines, they don't have vaccines for some African countries. They've finished all of the vaccines. So I think Erwin and Linda, you make good contributions. If there are other that wants to make contributions, please show by raising your hand, or you can just drop a comment or a question in the chat box.
And if I can just respond to those comments, I mean,
yes.
We know this, right? Because we know that we're not very good at preparing for emergencies because we're sleepwalking into climate change, right? The world is sleepwalking into climate change. And this is why, the only thing that changes governments' minds is mass action, right? So the only thing that put climate change on the top of the higher up the political agenda before the pandemic, at least, was huge mass action in countries around the world taken by young people. So mass mobilization is needed to ask profound questions of systems of governance. The failure, the pandemic failures, the failure of preparedness is a failure of governance and institutions. So, the demands for more democratic, responsive institutions, include, especially at the global level, directly connects to the lack of preparedness for a pandemic. We should now be drawing the parallels between our lack of preparedness for the pandemic and our lack of action on climate change, and making those same demands for fundamental reform. But as I say, mass action is the potential game changer here. And that's one of the things we have to look to.
Thank you for that response. Do we have any contributions from the participants? Okay, I've got a new message here. Okay, we've got from Pile. Besides mass protests our leaders are setting their voices at the multilateral platforms. And another question from Fatima. Government, or it's a comment, government does not engage with civil society on emergencies. So let's attend to this question. Besides mass protest, our leaders are setting their voices at the multilateral platforms. I'm assuming they're saying our African leaders here.
Yeah, I can only speak for civil society, and I certainly can't speak for Africa's leaders, but there are civil society institutions that are doing their best to engage with multilateral institutions. CIVICUS spends a lot of its time and efforts trying to influence UN processes in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, as well as in New York. There are loads of challenges about the receptiveness and responsiveness to those international institutions, which is why there's a big civil society reform agenda. These things can often seem quite technical, and they're certainly very opaque. And the civil society reform agenda for UN institutions can seem, like a somewhat esoteric agenda. But, as I think the pandemic's proved, international reform is absolutely vital. And, the civil society's international reform agenda is a serious one and well worked out one that envisages, ways of getting citizens' voices directly into international institutions so we can win change. The need is, I think, to connect the somewhat elite civil society working at the multilateral level to communities and street action, and those connections are always made. The need is to pursue insider and outsider strategies at the same time. Civil society often faces the insider-outsider dilemma, right? Whether to be in the meeting room trying to win some small piece of progress, or whether to be outside on the streets protesting and demanding change. And obviously the answer is you need to do both of those simultaneously and connect them. The radical demands for climate action made through protest may have some impact at the COP26, which happens later this year. But that will only, civil society needs to keep making those connections between kind of elite level work with institutions and the kind of energy and anger of street action. And I think those, I think it's fair to say those connections aren't always made. Because the key multilateral institutions at the UN level are based in the global north. There's particularly a global north, global south disconnect around those that needs to be addressed. So definitely more needs to be done there.
Okay, thank you. I think I
would say, sorry, if we don't speak up on the streets, our leaders will never know we're angry. So there's really, we would live in an age where there's no substitute for mass action. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop.
I guess in the context of COVID, I think it was just another layer of struggle that was, added in most, African countries. We, like in South Africa, we've got a triple threat of inequality, of poverty, and of unemployment. So it's just another fourth layer and maybe sixth layer or seventh layer that we have to deal with. So we find out that we're in a difficult position to actually, fight the pandemic. There is a comment, government does not engage with civil society on emergencies. There is a feeling in South Africa that the civic space is shrinking and the government doesn't engage much with the community. May I also take a contribution from Linda Mafu? Linda, you can engage the speaker.
Thank you so much. So I work at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria, and therefore coming from a position of being a donor. One of the biggest things that is needed, particularly coming from civil society, is still the kind of activism to push the donors to think differently. And we saw that within the COVID-19 pandemic, because we then, even at the Global Fund, with all the strict and long processes, we were able to turn around and be flexible enough to provide resources within 2 weeks. And it usually takes a year to get the resources to the countries. However, we're able to do that. And that was as a result of civil society advocacy and making strong, useful noise about people dying and the sense of urgency. So there could be flexibilities. I think number two, because I am in these multilateral platforms, what I see is that our government, particularly coming from the African context, our government do not go to those platforms well prepared in terms of what is going on in their countries and what is the ask therefore. They don't go well prepared, and therefore other people speak on their behalf, or they're supported in one way or another. So we also need to do a lot of advocacy in terms at country level, in terms of getting our government to be well prepared to understand the epidemic, to understand the pandemic, to understand some of the issues that are affecting communities and articulate those at these platforms. We are beginning to see a very strong voice from the Africa CDC and in all the different platforms, and there's a lot of leadership that is coming from there. However, again, the challenge is the engagement of the Africa CDC with civil society, so that there's a strong voice that is coming from community level. There's a strong voice that comes out of community monitoring. So those are key things that could influence some of the work that is being done at country level. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda Mafu, for this insightful contribution. I don't know if I'll take maybe one last contribution before we end this session. I don't know, Andrew, if you want to respond to Linda, and then maybe we can call it a day.
Well, I mean, yeah, everything she said, I agree with. I mean, it's great to get that insight from somebody, directly involved in these kind of issues, but particularly in the kind of health sphere. I think it's always been the case at CIVICUS that one of the solutions that we're looking for is to try to connect up different parts of civil society and try and get different parts of civil society talking to each other, try and get collective coalition action wherever possible. And as I say, try to connect, the urgency of the streets and the urgency of people's everyday issues and the desperate struggle for rights of communities. Always try to understand struggles as struggles for rights, and to try and bridge between that and those kind of somewhat attenuated and depoliticized workings of higher level processes. And the challenge is to try to keep making those multiple connections, but it's time to start making big demands. And as you were saying, David, it's not like our societies and our polities and our economies were functional before this pandemic, because they certainly weren't, and they weren't working for many people. And the pandemic has patterned on to and exacerbated these already existing problems. It's thrown more light on them. So, if this isn't the time when we ask for big change, then when is that time? So that's really where we are, and that's what civil society should be doing. Civil society now should be asking the big questions, making the big demands, and trying as much as possible to work collectively, respectful of the great diversity that civil societies, one of civil society's great assets, but to try and bring collective big asks to power, and above all, not to think that when this pandemic is over, our problems are solved, right? And that's key. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for making the time to share your work with us. We really appreciate it. May I take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining today's session. Shona, I don't know if you've got any closing remarks.
Thanks, Stanford. No, I don't have any closing remarks, but I just wanted to thank Andrew and David, and looking forward to further collaborations with you guys and further conversations and with your colleagues. And thanks to everyone for participating. I do hope that you join us at our next seminar series, which is focused on the resource curse. So we will be sending out notices about that, be the same platform, the same time, the same day, and we look forward to having you. And thanks, Stanford, thanks, Andres, thanks, Melanie. And just before we let Andrew go, I'm just dying to ask a Londoner this question. How are you feeling about your Freedom Day? Some of us are some of us are a little shocked that you're going to be going to nightclubs from the 19th. You're going to not have to wear masks. I just don't know how that's how are you guys feeling about that? How are Londoners feeling?
Well, currently this week I'm having to self-isolate because you know, I got, as we say, I got pinged by the app. You know, I got told to self-isolate for a week. So just being able to leave my house next week will feel like Freedom Day for me. But no, it's incredibly worrying and incredibly reckless. But you know, that's the stock in trade of our government. You know, that's their governing style. That's their hallmark. They do everything with an air of reckless self-confidence, and you know, I'm very concerned about what might happen. What's happened in the Netherlands when they've had this unlocking. There's been Netherlands unlocked 2 weeks ago. They're now having to lock everything down again. So we may have a brief taste of no restriction before they come back. But anyway, that's enough about the woes of being stuck in the UK, because as I say, you know, everywhere is dysfunctional and everywhere has its own problems, and I'm certainly not going to complain about my situation given the particular challenges in South Africa right now. So I just want to say thanks. Really enjoyed this. Hour has flown by. And Shona, it sounds like if you want to have another one of these with my colleague Clara, who at some point researches civil society resourcing, then that might be something we want to follow up on, huh?
Fantastic. We will definitely keep in touch. And thanks to everyone. And please keep safe, everyone. Keep your masks on unless you are in the UK on the 19th of July. Then you can take it off.
In which case, do what you want, apparently. Yeah.
Thanks, Stanford. Tthanks, Andres. Thanks, Mel. Keep
You're
safe,
welcome.
everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
David.
Everyone. Thanks, Danford. Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
David. We'll be in
Bye,
touch.
Okay, definitely.